Hello everybody, this is Mr. Moulton. Today we are going to be going over Chapter 4 from the textbook Growth, Diversity, and Conflict from 1720 to 1763. Now, we're going to talk about the three colonial regions again with the New England, Middle, and Southern. So let's go ahead and start off with New England. Here we can see the New England colonies here, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and then ultimately Maine eventually. Now, the elite nobles or the gentry or some groups of or classes of people, they owned 75% of arable land. Arable is land that is able to be farmed. You had something in 1712 called the Well-Ordered Family, which was written and published and sent out that said basically, since he is thy husband, God has made him the head and set him above thee, referring to the wife. So the wife's duty was to be subject to their husband, the men in their lives, and the wife's duty was also to love and reverence the husband. So it's kind of showing some class distinctions, amongst gender. It also said that each daughter shall have half so much as each son, one half in money and the other half in cattle. So the women were given less and not treated equally. Many women and men were married in their early 20s. By their 40s, they had 6 or 7 children. The reason so many children and married at that age was to be able to get out and having land and having those children work the land. You had Quakers, which we've talked about, religion, and evangelist Baptist churches that were welcoming these questioning women. Women were starting to say, why is this the case? And these churches, unlike others, were receptive and supportive of them. Now, the hope of having land of their own and becoming independent of landlords is what chiefly induces people to come to America. That's kind of around the year 1730. The idea of people having the freedom to do what they want and own what they can and work their land, that's why people were coming. You had competency, which was the ability to keep households solvent, and independency and pass it on to the next generation. Basically, to sum that up, make sure that there were appropriate finances and appropriate funds so people weren't in debt, so that when the dad died, the land could be passed on to the son or the daughter's family instead of having to pay off debts and other things. With marriage, the bride relinquished legal ownership of all property to the husband. So if the woman was given some land by her father or her family, when she would be married, that land would then get turned over to her new husband. If the husband died, the woman could keep a third of it to keep, and then would have to give up and the others instead of selling it and getting rid of it that way. They would also lose status in their community when their husbands died as well. Now in New England, around the year 1700, there were about 100,000 people. By the year 1725, that number had jumped up to 200,000. And by 1750, we're talking 400,000 people in the New England colonies. Now, those are massive amounts of number, massive amounts of people that are coming here, and so in order to be able to accomplish that, they had to start to divvy up and divide their farms and then divide them again, and ultimately it led to the farmland being able to only be given to one of their sons. Oftentimes that would be the oldest son. They still had, or at this time allowed, encouraged arranged marriages, but those were starting to kind of break down because there was just less land. A lot of families would do the arranged marriages based on politics or family status, that type of thing. But with less land to go around because there's more people here, those kind of started to go by the wayside. They started to also change from wheat or barley, English crops, from potatoes and maize. Some of those older crops, they were changing from those to the wheat and barley. And they were starting to barter, which is kind of like a modern day trade. Hey, I will give you 10 pounds of wheat if you give me 5 pounds or 10 pounds of apples or something like that, to be able to make sure that everybody could have what they needed in order to survive. Now, that's the New England colonies. As far as the middle colonies go, here we can see one, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. This is kind of the middle colony area, middle colony region. Now in the middle colony, there were homes to people of very differing origins, languages, religions, all sorts of things. It was very diverse in the middle colonies. Between growing crops and being able to financially prosper and do very well financially for yourself, it kind of led to some conflict. Not very many people overall were doing extremely well with their funds in the middle colonies. Things were a little tight. You had also something called tenant farm families that hoped for wealth, but they never really happened. It basically were people who rented and land from others, and they weren't able to make it. You had Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which had proprietors that had enormous land claims. These were people that had been there for a long, long time and had a lot of power and influence. They tried to control the settlers, and this led to problems, these proprietors. And this is ultimately going to lead to conflict between the new and the old immigrants and people that are coming to the Americas. Within Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, you had the Penn family, and they did this thing called the walking purchase of 1737. Basically, as far as they could walk within a certain amount of time is how much land they were going to buy from the Native Americans. They kind of snookered the deal a little bit and actually sent some professional runners to run as far as they could in order to get more land. But we also start to get that idea of indentured servants. Remember, these are predominantly men who are coming over. Their wages are being paid for them to come over to the Americas, and in return, they're expected to work a time period, anywhere probably between 5 and 7 years. Now, the half of the middle colony white men owned no land or property. They worked for others. The middle colonies were not, in some regards, a melting pot. There were some diversity. There was diversity in certain areas, but not overall. You had the migrants who preserved their cultural identities, whether that's language or religion or food or style of dress. As they came over, they kept those with them. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey, you had a lot of the Quakers. Religion, the Quakers were a peaceful kingdom. They attracted about 100,000 Germans, and they were leaving their home countries over in Europe because of military conscription, being forced to join the military, or religious persecution. They didn't like high taxes, and so they said, we are going to leave our country, our homes in Europe, wherever they might be, and come to the Americas to be able to avoid those things. And many of them came to eastern Pennsylvania. The most numerous, or the largest amount of immigrants that came to the middle colonies, were from the country of Ireland. And they said that this is a place that God has opened a door for their deliverance. All that a man works for is his own. So they had very high hopes and expectations of what it was going to be like as they came over into the Americas. Now, as I was mentioning, some of these people came and kept their cultural identities. Here we have just a little map of a place called Polish Hill. This is in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And within Polish Hill, there are a lot of people from Poland that live there. They've kept their foods, they've kept their traditions, they've kept their language, they've kept their style of dress. And even to this day, you can go there, and the people there are predominantly still going to be of Polish ancestry. You had Gottlieb Mittelberger, who was a German minister, that came out and said, Sunday is very badly kept. Many people plow, reap, thresh, hoe, or split wood and the like. Liberty in Pennsylvania does more harm than good to many people, both in soul and body. This German minister was upset with how people were treating the Sabbath or the Sunday, and were encouraging them to avoid those farming and avoid those chores at home, and turned to religion. Some wanted ministers to invoke government authority to uphold religious values. So these ministers were saying, hey, you government, you need to help protect these people and keep that, or allow them to help keep their Sunday as a holy day and turn towards God. So here we can see there was a lot of religious diversity in the British colonies in 1750. We've seen a similar map to this before, but it kind of breaks it down even more. Anglican and Puritan and Baptist and Quaker and Presbyterian, Catholic. There's so many different religions that are spread all throughout. But you can see kind of way up north, you have a lot of Presbyterian. Way down south, you have a lot of multi-denominational churches and different things that are going around. Now, here we can see a map of ethnic and racial diversity in the British colonies before 1775. So we can see where kind of the people went. Down there in the purple, we have African, which would be the slaves. That kind of light green would be English. We can see where they went and kind of where they established themselves. Now, culture, commerce, and identity. By 1720, the transatlantic shipping was growing, meaning they're shipping a whole lot more stuff between Europe and the Americas, between the colonies and the Britain. These colonies are now more connected than ever. By the 1730s, over 550 ships entered Boston Harbor. Just Boston Harbor alone, coming over from Europe and other places, buying and selling and trading goods. You also had something called the Great Wagon Road. Think of this kind of like we've talked about with the Native Americans earlier, with their freeways or their trails that they had. This is kind of what it is. It's a way that carried people and produce and finished merchandise and information, letters, newspapers, and things all throughout the three colonial regions through the colonies. And here we can kind of see a map of this, with the southern and kind of parts of the middle colonies where things were heading. That road there, would think of it like a modern day freeway, except obviously not paved and road cars and different things. Now you have a man by the name of John Locke. John Locke wrote a couple things. He was a philosopher, very influential in American history. First one he wrote in 1690 was called Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which basically had to do with the impact of the environment and experiences on human behavior and beliefs. What around us, whether it was in the environment or experiences we have had, have shaped our behaviors and beliefs. The thing that I always kind of think of to connect that to us is gambling. Here in Las Vegas, we are surrounded by gambling. It's normal for us to go to the grocery store or wherever it might be and see a slot machine, see someone gambling. But you take somebody from another state where they maybe don't have gambling, they come here and they're like, oh my goodness, what are these people doing? They're just not familiar with it. So our environment and our experiences have kind of shaped us, from whether you're alive in 1690 or all the way today. And it basically, though, also sums up that the character of individuals and societies is not fixed. Because we may be around these things does not mean that is going to make up our permanent philosophy and our permanent thought processes on things. We can change. John Locke also wrote another one in 1690 called The Two Treatises of Government, where he basically said political authority was not given by God to monarchs or leaders. It's derived from social compacts that people made to preserve natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Think of that like modern day today. We have a president of the United States. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, his power doesn't come from God. His power comes from us as the people. Even if you disagree with him, we as an American continent or American country have given him that power. We have voted that person, maybe in the future it will be a her, but we have voted that president into that position and given them that authority. There's also something called deism. It's a way of thinking, not necessarily an established religion. Thomas Paine referred to deism, and he said, it's my own mind is my own church. So instead of necessarily going to church, you can be able to have your own personal beliefs in different things. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson kind of were involved in deism a little bit. An 18th century philosophical movement that emphasized the use of reason to reevaluate previously accepted doctrines and traditions and the power of reason to understand and shape the world. So instead of taking what you were taught or learned at a young age, you're able to use your own thought process, use your own reasoning, your own thinking, and be able to come up with things yourself. And that is going to lead to something called the Great Awakening, which we'll talk about right here. You have pietism, emphasizing pious behavior. You're extremely religious. And the Second Great Awakening and things appealed to believers' hearts rather than their minds. You had the Great Awakening with George Whitefield and others. There's going to be multiple Great Awakenings that we're going to talk about, but basically it's just a spiritual revival. People are refocusing their attention on God, on religion, whatever that might be. Now, there are going to be some changes. Conservative ministers condemned crying or faintings and convulsions, which some churches had at this time and maybe even still do. They also didn't agree with working miracles or speaking with tongues that revivalist meetings were having. These conservative ministers were saying that's not the way God works. Obviously, there's a lot of interpretation and believings there, but Great Awakenings challenged the authority of ministers because they said, instead of having this grand education in religion or being able to read the Bible or being labeled as a preacher or pastor or whatever it might be, now this thing called the Spirit can also guide you. You can be led by that. Georgia started colleges to help gain that insight, gain education. Georgia said not education for privileges, but authority for many. So be the power that a college can have to be able to allow people to think for themselves is kind of what Georgia was going for here. Now in the South, you have the Church of England. They ignored African Americans 40%, and landless whites were 20%. So you have 60% of people in the South who basically really have no power or control. 40% of them are slaves, 20% of them are probably indentured servants or working for the landowners, and very, very poor. You have this Presbyterian revival with a preacher by the name of Samuel Morris. He was seeking a deeper religious experience. Then you also have this Baptist insurgency, that you started to have some radical Protestantism, talking about adult baptism. They were welcoming of African Americans and looked at them as equal. And this, at that time, wasn't really accepted. So you had the House of Burgesses that imposed heavy fines, who preached this idea of equality amongst all and some different things. So here you can see the southern colonies: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. Okay, you're going to have some war going on, the French and Indian War. There's a video here that we're not going to necessarily watch. Maybe we'll talk about it in class. But here we can kind of see a map. George Washington comes out of the French and Indian War as a hero that leads him to more things that we will be talking about later. But ultimately, we have this conflict between Britain and the native groups. War starting to spread over Europe, and William Pitt, he's the war architect for America and British. He supplied the everything for $1 million a year, and they were just astonished at how expensive that was. The cost of this war is going to lead to some later conflicts. Britain was winning within Canada, Cuba, the Philippines. Britain eventually forged a commercial and colonial empire that was worldwide. At one point they said that the sun never set on the British Empire, basically saying Britain controlled places around the entire globe where always the sun was up. Indians were not happy with this British win, and more settlers were coming over, and so you're going to lead to other wars like Pontiac's War and different things. And so basically here on the left, the pre-war boundaries, they're in purple. You can kind of see where the British controlled, and then it's striped, and then kind of that orangish color. But then after the French and Indian War, you can see the British had control of the land all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, there you can also see that dark kind of reddish line. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Basically what that Proclamation Line of 1763 was a line that the English settlers were not allowed to go beyond. The reason was the people in Britain, the king and different things, were worried that if people went too far in, that they would lose control, and that they would stop paying their taxes, and that Britain would lose control of those colonists. And it was all about Britain keeping control and keeping the money coming. Now, they gained control of the oceanic trade. There was some new manufacturing going on, new technology. Now Britain is the most powerful nation in the world. They're starting to trade with the colonists, as we mentioned kind of at the beginning, with all those boats coming into Boston Harbor and different things. And there started to be a massive amount of debt within the colonies. And Britain were the ones that were paying for these. And they were not happy about that. So you also start to get this land that's starting to trade hands a little bit. Connecticut is sold. Pennsylvania is sold. Well, they actually sell parts of the same land. Oops, it's going to lead to some problem. You have land disputes in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New York. You can kind of see there's many different groups, the Paxton Boys, the South Carolina and North Carolina regulators, that is going to lead to more and more conflict. And ultimately what all of this is leading up to is the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution War between the colonists and the British. You have the Scots-Irish settlers, aka the Paxton Boys, who go and massacred the Conestoga Indians. They leave no witnesses, just complete and utter destruction. You have the Scottish and Anglo-Americans that clashed with the Cherokees in South Carolina. So you got these problems going on with the colonists and the Native Americans. You got these problems with the colonists and the British. In 1766, in North Carolina, if you couldn't pay your debt, you would lose your land. Mobs started to intimidate judges. They closed their courts, freed their comrades from jails. Things were just starting to get very, very contentious. A lot of problem, a lot of conflict between all the groups within the colonies, and ultimately some major things are going to change. Now, just as a reminder, this is 1720 to 1763-ish. Growth, Diversity, and Conflict, Chapter 4, American History textbook. Thank you so much for paying attention.